मधुबातारितायते मधुक्षरन्ति सिन्धवः मध्वेन सन्तोषधेः मधुनक्तम् उतोषसि मधुमत्पार्थिवगुं रजहम् मधुद्दौरस्तु न पिता मधुमान्न वनस्पतिर्मधुमागुम् अस्तु सूर्यः मध्विर्गावो भवन्तु नः ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः. May the winds blow sweetly, may the rivers flow sweetly, may days and nights be sweet to us. May the trees and plants be sweet to us. May the dust of the earth be sweet to us. May the sun shine on us sweetly. May all beings be happy. May all beings be peaceful. May all beings be blissful. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Friends, I am very happy to introduce to you this morning Swami Manishananda, a monk of the Ramakrishna order. He is my brother monk coming from Seattle Vedanta Society. I met him in 1973 when I first went to Seattle. He is a disciple of Swami VedantaSTL, whose guru was Swami Brahmananda. I remember Swami invited me to speak on Sri Ramakrishna during their birth anniversary, during Sri Ramakrishna's birth anniversary service. He is first, at that time it says joined. He got his final vows in 1994 from Swami Bhutishanandaji, who came here in 1988. Anyhow, I am really happy that he agreed to speak on the art of the spiritual unfoldment this morning to you. He is a great builder. The Swami, if you go to Seattle, we have a retreat center. He and another monk, mostly he last several years, they have 10 or 12 acres. I think it is 45 minutes drive from Seattle. They built a beautiful center, retreat center. So he, carpentry, electric, gas, all kinds of, he knows all kinds of work that we need, you know. But at the same time, he practices, he lives in a wooden cabin, wood cabin. Very nice. I went to his room and saw that how he lives. Very small room with his books, meditates, and does work for the master. So I do not want to spend too much time to say many things about him, but he will speak on the art of spiritual unfoldment. Swami Manishananda.
Revered Swami Chaitanananda Ji, Swami Nishpapananda Ji, devotees and friends. I'm very happy to be here. First of all, I'd like to thank Swami Chaitanananda Ji for his kind introduction. I have not come to St. Louis as a speaker, I've come as a pilgrim. In this country, for us devotees of Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, Swami Vivekananda, and the principles of Vedanta, our Vedanta societies are places of pilgrimage. So I'm very happy to be here. to enjoy the company of my brother Swamis and the devotees and the friends of this society. And last but not least, I never had the opportunity to meet Swami Satprakashanandaji. I had talked to him on the phone a few times. I used to make phone calls for Swami Vivekananda in the 70s. And I never had the opportunity to come. So now I'm getting to see the society that he started and has continued on all these years. And I'm very happy to be here. Now to the subject proper. The art of spiritual unfoldment. Webster's dictionary defines art as application of skill and taste according to aesthetic principles for the production of something beautiful. Now we not only appreciate beauty when we see it, we also, in our own life, feel some need of artistic expression. All of us do. Perhaps it's in the traditional arts of painting or music or sculpture, or maybe it's the literary arts, the martial arts, the industrial arts. And I'm very happy that the ladies here have mastered the culinary arts. We have to cook for ourselves where I live, so I'm enjoying these masters of the culinary arts very much. We not only appreciate beauty when we see it, but we learn to appreciate it even in unseen things. And the spiritual life is not always just out in the open. It's an inner thing for the most part, but it's expressed externally. There are many comparisons to art in the world around us. For example, St. Louis is a baseball town, and I'm sure many of you have heard the late Jack Buck say that double play was a thing of beauty, poetry in motion. So we can see art in all avenues of life. It's expressed everywhere. Our life can and actually should be viewed as an art. We should view life as an art. And spiritual unfoldment is the ultimate art project. It's the grandest and sublimest expression of beauty, because God has been described as beauty, peace, and sublimity. Now this morning, we're going to look at a few facets of this topic. First, that this art form of spiritual unfoldment, in the practice of this art form, we're not creating anything new. We're unfolding something that's already within us. Second point will be that self-effort and determination are needed in the art of spiritual unfoldment, just like they're needed in any avenue of life. The third, we're going to look at some of the qualifications for practicing this art form. And then lastly, we're going to look at one of the great tools in this art form, and that is attitude. It's not just what we do, but how we do it that makes our work an art. Someday, either in this life or in some future life, all of us will attain this form of artistic expression, the spiritual life. All of us will realize that perfection or divinity that lies deep within us. Our infinite nature is there. So we're all either practicing now or destined to practice this art of spiritual unfoldment. Why? Because our nature is infinite. We'll be forced at some point to address the fact that the finite world can't satisfy us 100%. And we'll feel the pressure of our infinite nature. Now, a beginning student went to a teacher to learn the art of wood carving. Now, the first assignment that the teacher gave was this. He gave the student a block of wood, handed it to the student, and said, "Carve an elephant." use the chisel and the mallet and carve an elephant out of this block of wood. The student said, "Sir, that's very, very difficult." And the teacher replied, "You see, it's not really difficult. With the mallet and the chisel, just remove everything that doesn't look like an elephant. It's not that hard." Now, I would say both the student and the teacher were correct in what they said, because in theory it's easy, but in practice it's difficult. What happened? For several months, all the attempts at wood carving by the student were looked at, and the student thought, boy, these aren't very artistic, and into the wood stove they went. All of his attempts were consigned to the wood stove for a long time. Of course, we find in Vedanta, or we learn, that nothing's 100% good or 100% bad, so at least they got a few BTUs out of those things. They got a little bit of heat. The saints and the prophets and the divine incarnations, they tell us that God is within. Swami Vivekananda says each soul is potentially divine. The goal is to manifest this divinity. Christ says the kingdom of heaven is within. And the Roman mystic Plotinus, he says this: "Withdraw into yourself, and if you do not find yourself beautiful yet, act as does the creator of a statue that is to be made beautiful. Cut away all that is excessive, straighten out all that is crooked, and never cease chiseling until you shall see the perfect goodness established in the stainless shrine." In any art form, we need inspiration, we need instruction, and we need a lot of practice. And it's the same in the spiritual life. We need all of those things. We do not become a master artist all at once in any field. Effort's always needed. This reminds me of what a famous TV personality once said. Milton Berle, many of you know who he was. He said, "It took me 10 long years of struggle to become an overnight success." Of course, he said it tongue-in-cheek. But in a serious matter, there's no overnight success in spiritual life, in this art form. There's no immediate overnight success. If one appears to quickly succeed in spiritual life, quickly control the outward tendencies of his or her mind, quickly get, we could say, centered, and make God their all in all, we can infer that a lot of work has been done previously in a former lifetime. Sri Ramakrishna illustrates this with his story. He says that it was seen that one bright sunny morning, one gentleman poured himself a glass of wine, drank that glass, and then fell over, dead drunk. People were amazed. But they didn't know that he'd been drinking all night. This was the last one. So in the same way, if we see real quick success, it means we've been drinking in knowledge and love of God. We've been practicing spiritual life all night long. Of course, the practice is hard. We enthusiastically commence our practice, our spiritual practices, with this noble aspiration to realize God and attain cosmic consciousness. That became kind of what we call buzzword back in the 60s, cosmic consciousness. But what happens is this: we don't immediately attain cosmic consciousness. Somehow or other we lose that letter S, and instead of attaining cosmic consciousness, we quickly arrive at a state of comic consciousness. And why do I say that? Because for a long time our efforts at spiritual life seemed to us to be a comedy of errors. We've all felt that. There seemed to be a lot of errors in our spiritual life. Friends, this is natural. This should not unnerve us. This is part of the process. This should not discourage us. Rome was not built in a day. Remember, the wood carving student, through all of his attempts into the wood stove, but he didn't quit. And eventually he became a master wood carver. Swami Vivekananda unequivocally tells us that our little failures are but the pillars of our future success. This is what Swamiji says. Never mind failures. They are quite natural. They are the beauty of life. These failures, what would life be without them? It would not be worth having if it were not for struggles. Where would be the poetry of life? So never mind these failures, these little backslidings. Hold to the ideal 1,000 times, and if you fail 1,000 times, make the attempt once more. Now, all of us in our present state, we're identified with nature. Time, space, causation, that's our world. We're not satisfied with it, but we're somewhat identified with it. And we notice that Mother Nature very slowly and gradually is pushing us forward, goading us forward, leading us onward to our goal of spiritual unfoldment, of union with God, of freedom from time, space, and causation. This is her job. And it's very slow. Through all the experiences of life, nature is goading us onward for higher things. Now, I'm from Seattle, and that's the coffee capital of this country. So we Seattleites, we like to think that Mother Nature has some connection with Seattle because she doesn't believe in instant coffee. No, nobody in Seattle does. That's espresso country. So, no, Mother Nature doesn't believe in instant coffee. She roasts us thoroughly, completely in the fires of experience. Then leisurely, slowly, meticulously grinds us to perfection. That's her modus operandi. Eventually, in the course of many lifetimes, we will arrive at a state of mind where we are not content to be slowly, unconsciously pushed by nature. We feel that discontent. I want to accelerate my progress. I want to make self-effort towards God realization. I want to do something to unfold my infinite nature. It's only now at this point that spiritual unfoldment is elevated to an art form. It's when we consciously want to accelerate our progress. We start to emotionally feel the attraction of our infinite nature. We want to identify with something that's greater, larger, more sublime, more profound than just the sense world. That's when we become artists in this art form. And when that comes, gradually, strong determination comes. Little by little, stronger and stronger determination comes to keep practicing. We want to get off the wheel of birth, death, and rebirth. We feel that. We want to be free. So we are determined to become free. This reminds me of a true story that happened in Seattle in 1962. This was a few years before I came to our Vedanta Society. As some of you may know, we had a World's Fair there called Century 21. Swami VedantaSTL, the founder and head of our society, he invited some of his brother Swamis from the West Coast to come and see the fair, meet the devotees, and come and stay for a few days. See, as Vedantists, we like to pray together. We like to occasionally sit around and enjoy a meal together. We like to work together. And we like to have fun together because we become like family. So Swami Vivekananda invited these Swamis. Shokanandaji was there, and Swami Sheshanandaji. the last living disciple of Holy Mother. He's passed away now. He was there, and one or two other swamis from the West Coast. So they've gone to the fairgrounds, and one of the devotees disappeared for a little while and came back with a bunch of tickets for the amusement park. So they went to the amusement park, and he had tickets for the carousel. So they're all there, the carousel's going around, that comes and stops, and they're all ready to get up onto the carousel. Swami Ashokanandaji, he got on the carousel. Swami Vivedishananda was there, the others, all the devotees came, but Swami Asheshananda wouldn't get up on there. So Swami Vivedishananda said, he called him Kiran, because he was senior to him. He said, Kiran, get up onto the carousel. You know, it's going to go in a few minutes. And the other devotees were saying, Swami, get up. And nobody could get him to budge. He balked. Finally said, you've got to get on now. And then what did Swami Asheshananda say? He said, I have struggled my whole life to get off the merry-go-round. I am not getting back on the merry-go-round now. And he did not get on. Now, if we look at the formal qualifications for practicing this art form of spiritual unfoldment, we see that they're very, very lofty. For example, one of our scriptures, a 15th century treatise called VedantaSTL, or the essence of Vedanta, it lists the various prerequisite qualifications that one must have in order to commence, to begin the study of Vedanta. Just to start, you have to have these. When I read this many years ago, I felt it was very disheartening. It was too lofty for me. According to VedantaSTL, before one even begins the study of Vedanta, one must have already studied proper articulation and pronunciation, rituals, ceremonies, grammar, etymology, astronomy, so on and so forth. Those are the first couple. Then the prerequisites get more difficult down the list. One must be totally absolved from all the sins committed in this life and in previous lives and be entirely pure in thought before you start Vedanta. We were under the impression that was what we were striving for. Again, this book, and it's a glorious book, says one must have adopted the means of attaining enlightenment. And these are the real core things. Discrimination between the real and the unreal, renunciation of the fruits of action, like that. Control of the mind and senses, forbearance. Most of you have heard those. And lastly, one must have developed some longing for liberation. One must be feeling the pressure of their infinite nature a little bit. These are all qualifications that this book says we must have before we can begin the study of Vedanta. We don't have all these qualifications. So what about us? We may not qualify. But the fact is, even though technically we may not qualify, still, we want to improve and become a better person. We want to improve our character. That much we can say. We want to find some abiding peace amidst the turmoil and the uncertainties of life. Everyone's felt that sometime. And also, we want to unfold our infinite nature. We know that that's what we should do. So, is our case hopeless? No, not at all. I don't think so. Swami Vivekananda has clearly declared that the great truths of Vedanta must be made broadcast to everybody. The truths such as the omnipresence of God, the unity of existence, the divinity of humanity, the harmony of religions, all these things, they must be broadcast to everyone. Let each person start where he or she is at and add on and grow in their spiritual life. While thinking about this topic of preparation, a few things came to my mind, qualities that I think a modern seeker should have. Of course, along with the other ones. If we have those, then then we're number one seekers. But I've listed 6 points, and it's not an exhaustive list, that in my own mind I thought that a modern spiritual seeker should have. First of all, we should have an intellectual understanding and also an emotional feeling, or our heart should be in sync with our intellect, that this world cannot give us 100% satisfaction. This world is presented by the senses. We need to have that feeling. Life in this world is never perfect. We need to understand that. Otherwise, we would just languish as happy animals if life was perfect here. We didn't have any higher aspirations. So that's the first point. The second point is we need an initial faith, or we can say a working faith. Faith in what? Our Vedantic commentators say that we should have faith in the Scriptures, the import of the Scriptures. Not necessarily always the literal interpretation, but the implied meaning sometime. So the import of the Scriptures we need to have faith in. We also need to have faith in the words and the teachings of the great teachers of the particular spiritual path that we follow. In our case, the words of Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, Swami Vivekananda, and the apostles of Sri Ramakrishna. We need to have faith in their words. And also, we need to have faith in ourselves. Yes, there's something in me that needs to be free. There's something in me that is not satisfied by this, we can say, this billiard table of time, space, and causation. Sometimes we feel like we're a ball out on the billiard table. We're being knocked around by the forces of nature. I'm not satisfied anymore out on this billiard table. I want a secure pocket. I want a secure pocket to find. So we need to have faith that, yes, that secure pocket is some kind of relationship with God, either personal or impersonal. And we already have it in us. We just have to unfold it. Swami Vivekananda says that one is an atheist who does not believe in oneself. The old religion said that one is an atheist who does not believe in God. The new religion says that one is an atheist who does not believe in himself or herself. Now, this working faith incorporates a positive attitude towards ourself and towards our ultimate destiny. And it's combined, this positive attitude is combined with the necessary realism to understand that, yes, there will be some obstacles to cross. There will be some evolutionary growing pains. So it won't always just be perfectly smooth. We need to be a realist in that sense. Not in the sense that we're a materialist, but in the sense that there will be some obstacles that we'll have to meet. Eventually, this working faith will become real conviction when we start to get our own spiritual experience. Then it becomes unshakable conviction. The third point I noted was a spirit of adventure. Spiritual life is really a great adventure. That's what I've found. I did a number of adventurous things in my early life. I was 7 years, I was a mountain climber, and I did many adventurous things. But I found that spiritual life is the greatest, grandest, and sublimest of all the adventures. And I've never been bored for even one day in my monastic life. So it is really the great adventure. And this art of spiritual unfoldment is something akin to treasure hunting. See, we know the treasure exists. In order to be an artist, we already are a little dissatisfied, and we have some working faith now in God and in our own self. So we know the treasure exists, and we know where to look within ourselves. Now, when we look within ourselves, that can be a real adventure, because in our subconscious mind lurk many obstacles, many wild animals. in our subconscious mind. And trying to control and purify our mind is really an undertaking. It's something that we struggle onward with faith. So we need the spirit of adventure, which includes faith, strength, fearlessness, and endurance. As most of you know, when Swami Vivekananda was a wandering monk in India before coming to this country, he carried this book, The Imitation of Christ, by Thomas à Kempis, with him. And I've read that book a number of times. And one thing that Thomas à Kempis says is very nice. He also talks about strength. This is what he says. We must live boldly. We must work boldly. We must die boldly. Fear is weakness. Fear is sin. So that's it, a spirit of adventure. And that means a little bit of boldness needs to be there too. The fourth one I have is cheerfulness. Swami Vivekananda says the first sign that you are becoming religious is that you are becoming cheerful. When a person is gloomy, that may be dyspepsia, but it's not religion. A 19th century Anglican priest, he said this. He said to somebody who was perhaps overly sober, he said, "Please don't mistake my frivolity for being shallow, just as I never mistake your graveness for profundity." Now, gradually, our cheerfulness becomes less dependent on external circumstances. Still a little bit, but it becomes less. Our mind becomes a little bit insulated. The intensity and duration of our reactions start to become less. So that cheerfulness starts to grow, and we find, when we analyze it, the cheerfulness is due to the fact that we're connecting ourselves with God, either personal or impersonal now. It's coming from within us. And yes, we may react a little bit to outside things, but again, the center of gravity is on God, and we come back, and our cheerfulness comes back. We learn that, or we notice that this cheerfulness becomes much less dependent on external things. How big my car is, or how much name and fame I have. Those things are pretty transitory. And fame can turn to infamy, in a matter of minutes sometimes. So we become less dependent. I live at our retreat, which is 45 miles north of Seattle. And we used to have a devotee. He passed away in the 90s. And he was our caretaker for a number of years. I moved out there in 1987, so he was there for many years as our caretaker. I'll tell you a little story about him. He was a very cheerful person. And he had been in northern British Columbia for 25 years, living in a little hut, reading Vedanta books that he got from Vedanta Press. He had never met anybody in Vedanta. So he wrote us a letter. Anyhow, he ended up coming down, and he was our caretaker for a number of years. He's totally a rustic person. He'd only talked on a phone 10 times in his entire life. He did not drive a car. He only wore shoes maybe 10 days a year. He had a long white beard. He's about 65, 70 years old. But the fact is, he was a great devotee of Sri Ramakrishna. He wasn't really a philosopher, but he had so much faith that Sri Ramakrishna is the divine incarnation for this age, that was carrying him through all these years. Anyhow, his name was Fred. I'm going to get back to him in a minute. I just want to let you know who Fred was and what he was like. Now, we had a visitor in our monastery in Seattle. He came from somewhere on the East Coast, and he stayed with us for 4 or 5 days. And it was evident after one day that this man's a pure materialist. Why did he come here? We were scratching our heads. All he was talking about was that his car was bigger than other cars, and that his swimming pool was the biggest one in his neighborhood. And we were all thinking, well, Tucker's brought him, we'll serve him as a manifestation of God. But we were puzzled. So he said, I want to go, this is in 86, I want to go to Vancouver to see Expo 86, the World's Fair. And in fact, I've booked my flight out of Vancouver back to the East Coast. So he said, I'm going to rent a car, and I hear you have a retreat right on the way, 1 mile off the freeway between Seattle and Vancouver, so I'd like to see it. So I thought, you see, Fred was there alone. And we had no phone out there, no running water, no electricity. It was camping for years. For years, even the first many years I was there, it was camping. And I thought, I need to prepare this man for Fred somehow. So I told him what I've told you about Fred. And as I was telling him, boy, he was giving me some looks like, this guy, must be totally miserable all the time. Because he could equate happiness or cheerfulness or everything with his material possessions. So anyway, he went. Later on that week, I went out and I thought, let me find out from Fred if anything happened. Well, I was not disappointed. So Fred told me later, he said, you see, I was sitting in my little cabin, little log cabin, 8 by 12, 96 square foot, that's where he lived. He said, I saw this big fancy car pull up. I didn't know who it was, maybe it's the government. Maybe it's, who knows, maybe it's a salesman, neighbor, I don't know who he is. So he said, well, I figured, I better go down there, at least see who it is. So he walks down. In the summer, he never got out of his pajamas. Always barefoot, long white beard. But the thing is, he's a great devotee of Sri Ramakrishna. And that was his saving thing. He had a lot of eccentricities, but if you're around him, he had total faith that Thakur was the avatar of the age. So he said it. He said, I walked down, as I approached the car, I saw this very well-dressed man get out. And he looks at me, and he's giving me really dirty looks. Really strange looks, and he's kind of sizing me up. And he does not introduce himself to me. Rather than saying, I've come from the Seattle Center, he walks right up to me and looks me face to face, like 3 feet away. He looks at me, and the first words he says to me is, why do you lead such a miserable life? So Fred was taken aback. Well, what did Fred do? He thought for a minute, and he folded his hands, and he said, I'm sorry, sir, but I just didn't know I was that unhappy. So here's the man, Fred. He was very cheerful. His cheerfulness was due to the fact that he had so much bhakti for Sri Ramakrishna, and that everything else was cheerful. So actually he had nothing externally, really to call his own, but here's this man, very cheerful. Now, spiritual growth is never in a straight line. I see many veteran Vedantists here, and all of you can attest to the fact that spiritual growth is not in an exact straight line. There's a lot of ups and downs, a lot of wave motion here. But generally, over the course of a lifetime, the crests get higher and the troughs get higher. The intensity and duration of our downtime gets less. So it's not in a straight line. We have to be as cheerful as possible as we gradually progress from a comedy of errors through the tragedies of minor defeats and the exuberances of small successes, eventually to the fulfillment of spiritual unfoldment. So we need to try to be cheerful. The next point I jotted down was a realistic viewpoint. We should not be an optimist nor a pessimist, because that will leave us vulnerable to suffering. We should not be an optimist nor a pessimist, but rather a realist. An optimist thinks that the glass is half full of milk. The pessimist thinks that the glass is half empty. But the realist knows that after one has drunk the milk, they're going to have to wash the glass. That's part of the deal. Or at least rinse it and put it in the washing machine. So that's part of the deal. We need to be a realist. There will be some struggles in this art form of spiritual unfoldment. It's the nature of it. Any art form has struggles, and this one does too. We should be ready for it. A realist sees the world for what it is. Our philosophers say this world is bunch of pairs of opposites. Pain and pleasure, honor and dishonor, victory and defeat, heat and cold. Like, we need to know, this is what it is. We need to be realistic about it. We're still going to experience those things, but our inner life will grow. In every kind of art form, being a realist is not necessary, like painting. You have modern art, impressionistic art, abstract art. You don't need to be a realist there. There's a story about Picasso, true story. This was shortly after World War II, and he was in Paris. And he happened to meet an American GI who was stationed there. And somehow they met, and they were having lunch together at a little sidewalk cafe. And they were talking back and forth, and the topic of art naturally came up. And the American GI told Picasso that, he said, I don't like modern art, I don't like impressionistic art, because I like things to be portrayed exactly as they are, just exactly as they are. Picasso kept quiet. He didn't say anything. A few minutes later, in the course of conversation, this American GI started thinking about home, thinking about his fiancée waiting for him there. And he asked Mr. Picasso, he said, would you like to see a picture of my fiancée? Picasso was very gracious. He said, sure, let me see a picture. So this man pulls out his wallet, and he digs deep, and he finds this tiny little picture, and he pulls it out, and he hands it to Picasso. And Picasso looks at it for a minute and says, my word, is she really as tiny as that? So you don't... Picasso got the last laugh, but he didn't always get the last laugh. During his lifetime, there was a fictitious news story that was circulating during Picasso's lifetime. It went like this. This is a quote. This was what was circulating. Artist Pablo Picasso surprised a burglar at work at his new chateau. The intruder got away, but Picasso told the police he could do a rough sketch of what the intruder looked like. On the basis of his drawing, the police arrested a Mother Superior, the Minister of Finance, a washing machine, and finally the Eiffel Tower. So that's realism. Anyhow. The final prerequisite that I jotted down was, in order to be an artist in this art of spiritual unfoldment, we have to have finished with any interest in mystery mongering, occult powers, and all these things. We have to be done with all that. And we have to have accepted the twin ideals of character improvement and purification of our mind stuff. If we are still interested in the occult and all these things, that means we still have some time left until we can really start this art of spiritual unfoldment. Because Swami Vivekananda says character building is the thing, and purification of mind. Now, let's look at another topic, attitude as an aid to our spiritual unfoldment. Every art form has its respective tools. And in spiritual life, the main tool that is near to us is our own mind. It's the main tool. It's the nearest thing. It's our own mind. It's not our car. It's not our house. Those are not going to make us more spiritual or less spiritual. Spiritual growth is in the mind. It's not in the size of house we have or the gigabytes of hard drive on our computer. Spiritual growth is in our mind. I can't resist the temptation of telling you another story about Fred. This happened a few years after that first story. And we had a number of guests, and there was this husband and wife visiting, again from the East Coast somewhere. And we had our retreat day once a month. We have, 2-hour program in the morning, including reading, singing, Swami Bhaskarnandaji gives some commentary. And then we have potluck lunch and all that. Anyway, in the afternoon, I was showing these devotees around. And we worked our way over to Fred's little log cabin in the woods. And the lady was quite impressed. And out steps Fred. There's this rustic gentleman. And they get to talking, and all of a sudden, she says to her husband, she says, "Honey, we live in too big of a house. That's why we haven't realized God. We have 7 bedrooms. They had 40 acres or something. We need to build a little cabin, then we'll realize God. Then we'll grow spiritually. We need a smaller place." And then she looks to Fred with this look. "Now, give me some support and tell my husband that I'm right." Fred's answer was very interesting. He said, "You know, I don't think that the size of your house has anything to do with your spiritual growth, but there is one great advantage of living in a small little cabin, little hut like mine." And then she eagerly says, "What's that?" And he says, "The great advantage is this. In the long run, you save money on brooms." Now, this art of spiritual unfoldment, it's pretty demanding. When you get past the surface enthusiasm, it's pretty demanding art form. And it demands that we gradually refine and elevate our mind, including our attitudes towards ourselves and our fellow human beings, and all beings. We should not look upon ourselves as sinners. We should not have that attitude. We're potential saints. That reality is there, deep down inside us. And we're feeling the pressure of our infinite nature. We should not look upon ourselves as sinners. And also, as we grow, we cease to look upon everybody else as sinners. We don't live in a world of sinners anymore, because we start to understand that, yes, the divine is there in everything. It's just either more or less manifested. That's all. Now, I want to touch upon 2 more points before I finish, and that is service and giving. These are 2 practices in this art form. Without them, without service and giving, life is not only intolerable, but spiritual unfoldment's impossible. One of the great contributions of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda is the idea that service should be performed as worship of God. When service is done in this way, as worship, it greatly benefits not only the person who's serving, but also the recipient. And the philosophical foundation of service in this light is that the existence of a spiritual unity that underlies all of us. And service done in the right spirit will help us realize that unity and eventually become free. Now, there are many helpful attitudes to serve. Some of our commentators have said that Vedanta is like a ladder of 3 rungs. Let me elaborate a little bit. First, we have dualism, then qualified non-dualism, and then non-dualism. In dualism, the creator is seen as separate from the creatures, and one's fellow beings are like children of God. And an attitude when serving from this standpoint, they're all good, is God and humanity. We're all one as God's children. Very nice attitude. Our philosophers say that the next highest rung is called qualified non-dualism. This is where God is looked as the whole, and we're looked as parts. We're parts of a larger whole. And the attitude when serving from this viewpoint or standpoint is God in humanity. From God and humanity, we become more internalized. God in humanity. God now is not extra cosmic. God is immanent in everything. The highest rung is non-dualism. Non-dualism says that God alone is real, or Brahman alone is real. The world is some kind of illusion. There's one great being that's appearing as all of this. We haven't realized it, but we can still take the help of an attitude from that highest rung, and that is God as humanity. So we've gone from God and humanity to God in humanity to God as humanity. All of them are good. All of these attitudes when serving will propel us on our journey of spiritual unfoldment. What about giving? Emerson has said that the most valuable gift we can give is a portion of ourselves. Einstein said, only a life lived for others is worth living. And one Catholic cardinal, he said, we must not only give what we have, we must give what we are. Sometimes a person is more benefited if you give them a little bit of what you are than you hand them over a bunch of things. Giving itself is elevated into an art form when the attitude of the giver is pure and motiveless. See, our saints and philosophers, both East and West, but especially East, they have said that, well, the lowest and most common type of gift is a material gift. Money, creature comfort, so on and so forth. A little higher than that is intellectual gift, the gift of learning. And this has been simplistically stated in the famous saying, if you give a man a fish, you allay his hunger for one day. If you teach him how to fish, he can feed himself the rest of his life. So the gift of learning is higher than just material gift. The highest one, they say, is the gift of spiritual understanding. So whatever type of gift it is, our teachers say that that the gift should be given with a spiritual attitude, regardless of what type of gift it is, material or intellectual or spiritual. And also, we find that a gift does not cause us any psychological bondage. It won't cause the giver psychological bondage if there's no expectation of return and there's no wanting to control the recipient of the gift. Those two things will bind us. There's a saying that most of you have heard it, that bold print giveth, fine print taketh away. This is very true in giving. Very, very true. If there's fine print in the form of expectation, in the form of desire to control the recipient of your gift, this will add more psychological bondage, put more layers on your infinite nature, and you won't be progressing. But if you give something with a spiritual attitude, with no thought of return and not trying to control the recipient, then you remove some layers of ignorance, we would say, and you become closer to God realization. There's a very nice story that it's a true story that tells us or shows us that a spiritual attitude of giving without any thought of return, motiveless in everything, is tremendously beneficial to the giver. This is a true story. I'm not sure when this happened. I think it happened in the 50s, but not in recent decades. One girl graduated from university, and she was a very noble-minded girl. And she thought, before I start my career, let me give of myself for 1 year to some philanthropic organization, something. Let me forget about myself and give 1 year, then I will start my career. And she was from this country, and she hooked up with some organization in Europe, one of the towns of Europe, that was doing some kind of philanthropic work. So one day, and they didn't pay much, she was living on a very tight budget. One day, she walked down into a little business district near where they stayed, the volunteers stayed. And she picked up her mail, she got a letter from her parents, then she went to this sandwich shop. And as she entered the sandwich shop, she noticed that there's this man leaning against a light post out on the sidewalk. Shabbily dressed, slouch hat. He looked like he was in a pitiful condition. And then she goes in. Well, she happened to be seated in a position inside the little restaurant that she was looking out the window. So she could see the man right out the window standing there. And this is a very noble-minded, it's a true story, very noble-minded young lady. She opens her mail, and along with a letter from mom and dad was a $20 bill. That's a lot of money back then. So she's pretty happy about that. And then she reads the letter, and then she's waiting for her sandwich, and she sees that this man is still there, and her compassionate nature starts to come. This is a very noble-minded young lady. And she's thinking, you know, I could really use this $20, but I think this person could use it more than me. So she scratches off the address and the return address on the envelope, or inks it in and puts the $20 in it, keeps the letter. And she says, when I'm done, I'm going to give this to the man. And as she's eating, she has another thought. She's so noble-minded. I was really touched when I read this story. She starts thinking, why should I limit myself to a material gift? This man could use the gift of some kind words or some encouraging words or some kind of inspirational gift. So on the envelope, she writes in big letters, persevere. She said, I'll just hand it to him. He'll feel encouraged now. He can get through his hard time. So when she leaves, she hands this envelope to the man. There's no words exchanged, and she goes off. About 2 or 3 weeks later, she again is coming down in that neighborhood. She's walking down the street, and somebody taps her on the back. And she turns around, and lo and behold, here's this shabby-looking man. And before she can say anything, he puts his hand in his pocket and thrusts a whole wad of money into her hand and says, lady, Persevere was victorious and paid 50 to 1. A minister was once speaking, and his sermon was going on, and then on, and then on, and he noticed that one of his parishioners got up and walked out before he was done with the sermon. So the next time he saw that parishioner, he said, "Why did you get up before I completed my talk, my lecture? Why did you get up and leave? I mean, what's the explanation?" And the parishioner said, "Pastor, I got up, I went out to get a haircut." The minister said, "Haircut? Why didn't you get a haircut before you came?" He said, "Sir, when you started your sermon, I didn't need a haircut." So before I start seeing some of the men here walk out to get a haircut, I'm going to conclude, and I will conclude just by reiterating a few of the salient points that I've touched upon this morning. First, we've seen that spiritual unfoldment is the ultimate art project. Second, we've seen that in this art form, we don't create anything. We're uncovering or unfolding that perfection or divinity that's already in us. It's lying deep within us. At present, it's covered by some layers of ignorance. So we're not creating anything in this art form. Next, I touched upon a few points that I think a modern spiritual seeker should have. This is not an exhaustive list. There could be many others points. First was understanding that the world of the senses, as presented to us by the senses and cogitated by our mind about sense objects, can't give us 100% satisfaction all the time. Next, we need a working faith, faith in the import of the scriptures, faith in the words of the great teachers of whatever religious tradition that we follow, and faith in ourselves too. There is something in us that is struggling to be unfolded. Next, we need a spirit of adventure, and then we need to be cheerful. We need a realistic viewpoint. There will be some evolutionary growing pains along the way. We should be ready for those. And finally, we need to have finished with any desire or any fascination with occult powers or mystery mongering. And then last, I mentioned that we need to remember that attitude is one of the essential tools in this art form. It's a tool we must use wisely in order to reach the goal of this art form of spiritual unfoldment. Thank you very much.
Masatoma sadgamaya tamasoma jyotirgamaya vetturma amritam gamaya avirabirmayadi rudrajatte dakshinamukam tinamam pahi nityam. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. lead us from the unreal to the real, lead us from darkness to light, lead us from death to immortality, light us through, and guide us evermore with thy loving presence. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.